The Malawian government has asked for help from neighboring countries in the search for a military aircraft that went missing yesterday. It was carrying Vice President Saulos Chilima, former First Lady Shanil Dzimbiri, and 9 others to Mzuzu for the funeral of a former Justice Minister. In a televised address to the nation, President Lazarus Chakwera says they are receiving help from the international community to enhance their search operations. Air traffic says it lost contact with the aircraft after it failed to make its scheduled landing and was advised to return to Lilongwe. Chilima is seen as a potential candidate in next year's presidential election.
I know that this is a heartbreaking situation. I know that we are all frightened and concerned. I too am concerned. But I want to assure you that I am sparing no available resource to find that plane. And I am holding on to every fiber of hope that we will find survivors. We have already contacted our neighboring countries, as well as development partners, including the U.S. government, the British government, the Norwegian government, and the Israeli government, who have all offered support in different forms, including the use of specialized technologies that will enhance our capacity to find the plane sooner.
Aviation analyst and expert, as well as editor of SA Fly and Flightcom magazine, Dr. Guy Leitch joins me now to help us make sense of this missing military aircraft in Malawi. Dr. Leitch, good morning to you and thanks for joining us. So this was a military aircraft that went off radar about 45 minutes after takeoff. Just as an opener, do we know what type of military aircraft it would have been?
Yeah, good morning, Iman. No, I'm afraid we don't. There is a vast mass of contradictory information coming out about this aircraft. The initial reports suggested it was a helicopter, in which case it would have been the equivalent of the South African Oryx, the AS-330, a French helicopter. I'm not convinced of that. Other reports are saying that it's a Dornier 228, which is a turboprop. It's a 19-seater, normally turboprop, and Malawi Air Force does operate them. That would have been a more appropriate aircraft for this particular sector. So my at this stage is on a fixed-wing aircraft.
All right. So given what you suppose might be the type of aircraft used, what are your initial impressions of the circumstances surrounding its disappearance?
Yeah, well, that's very easy for me to say because I'm afraid it's a terrifically ordinary accident from what we know so far. This is what the aviation industry calls visual flight into instrument weather conditions. So that we know that the weather was very bad in Mzuzu. It tried to land, it couldn't. The information that your listeners will probably be wanting to know is, well, what sort of landing aids do they have at Mzuzu? And to the best of my knowledge, having looked it up, I can't find any landing aids other than a very obsolete, what's called a non-directional beacon, and that probably wasn't even working. So it would have relied on what we call a visual approach, where the pilots have got to see the runway. If that wasn't possible, they probably were under a lot of pressure to get their VIP to this funeral, and this is a very common problem in aviation, where pilots just press on when they shouldn't and then hit the ground too early or too late. There are very famous accidents around this already. We probably well remember the Colby Bryant crash. It was a helicopter, flew into bad weather. Also, Sol Kersner lost his son Butch under similar circumstances, again in a helicopter flying into bad weather. And in fixed-wing aircraft, it just happens all too frequently. What is remarkable about this particular incident at this stage is that they haven't found it. The accident, or the aircraft, was lost around about 10 o'clock yesterday morning. Oh, let me also just correct another thing that goes out, and that is that the aircraft disappeared off the radar. There's no radar coverage there at all. There is marginal radar coverage around Lilongwe, and that only extends for 30 or 40 kilometers. This Mzuzu is nearly 350 kilometers from Lilongwe, so it wasn't ever on the radar when it was battling to land. But what the aircraft should have had, and it should have been serviced, was an emergency locator transmitter, an ELT. And the more modern ones of that, which again it should have had, actually transmit the precise location of the aircraft in terms of latitude and longitude coordinates. It shouldn't take this long to find it. They should be able to just say, there it is, go send a helicopter or send out a ground party and find it. And it's inexplicable that it's taking so long.
Again, as you said, there were, conflicting reports, and there does seem to be a lack of clarity as to both the timeline of events and the availability of information in terms of the type of aircraft and so on. I'm interested in that languaging. I mean, you talked about, because the official report says, it went off radar about 45 minutes off takeoff, and you're saying essentially that there would not have been radar coverage. So it's almost like a misrepresentation of the facts. Would that be an accurate understanding of what you've said?
Well, I would agree. I don't say it's a deliberate misrepresentation, but this phrase, it went off the radar, is sort of in common use. It's like saying the airplane nosedived. It's become to mean nothing. My view is that there was no radar coverage in the area anyway, and indeed there was probably minimal coverage on the normal, what we call VHF radio as well.
Right. So officials, we understand, were also using telecommunications towers to track the last known position of the plane to within a 10-kilometer radius of one of the plantations that surround Mzuzu. But we also understand the area is dominated by the Vipia mountain range, and this would then also complicate matters further.
110%. This is a very difficult area to fly into because it is so mountainous. It's on the Malawian plateau to the west of Lake Malawi. The mountains and the weather are a perennial hazard. I also need to point out, though, that cell phone triangulation can be very accurate indeed. I mean, if you can have a Find Me function on your phone, which will almost tell you what room it's in. So again, it's inexplicable that they should be having such a problem finding the aircraft. Look, it's not without precedent. Kenyan Airways 15 years ago lost a Boeing 737 into a bog, into a swamp, and it took them about 2 or 3 days, as I recall, to find it. But that's because the entire aircraft had disappeared into a swamp. This aircraft, we believe, has crashed into trees. It would suggest to me at this stage that the equipment that it should have had on board in terms of an emergency locator transmitter was not being serviced properly and was not working.
And this is what's puzzling. I mean, when you talk about the Kenyan Airways example, that's 15 years ago. The technology, one imagines, is exponentially better and more sophisticated in terms of instrumentation, a decade and a half later. As you say, inexplicable that an emergency locator transmitter wasn't on board or perhaps wasn't serviced. I mean, this is someone who is the vice president of the country. This is the executive leadership team of a country. You would expect them to fly on a plane that, has, and maybe you can talk to us about this, before it is cleared to flight, it would have to pass some checks and balances and some tests, no?
Absolutely, man. But that's particularly the case in the civil environment, where the civil aviation environment is incredibly tightly regulated. We have a very strong regulator in South Africa, which is why our Civil Aviation Authority is very highly rated by ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. But the military, I'm afraid, is slightly less well regulated, or in many cases is slightly less well regulated. And perhaps the regular 5-year changes to the battery of the ELT, of the emergency locator transmitter, wasn't done. I'm speculating here. At the same time, let me point out that if it was a helicopter, as many reports have suggested, this helicopter was built in the 1970s, so it's 50 years old. Even the Dornier 228, which I believe it was built in the late 90s. So again, this is a 30-year-old aircraft. The technology has often not been updated into more modern equipment. But again, all of this equipment requires good ground stations to work. It requires what we call instrument landing systems, or it requires sophisticated global navigation systems to give accurate guidance. And it also requires what are approved let-down procedures, if you like, to approach airfields. And these have to be carefully designed I believe Mzuza didn't have any of these facilities. So they were operating very much on their own, if you like, in the dark out there, although it was mid-morning, but without support from ground services, probably in an outdated old aircraft. And certainly my belief is that they weren't on the radar.
I've got just a few moments left, Guy, maybe just to wrap. Obviously, the family members and all of those who are, all of their country people would be worried and hopeful of a positive outcome. I know that the president has said the US, the UK and Norway, as well as Israel, have offered assistance. What could happen now that could hopefully yield a positive result, even if people aren't found alive, but at least to survive, to find and to recover what is left of that potential wreckage?
Well, you've got the words right, Iman. You go from search and rescue to just a recovery operation at a certain stage, but normally after 2 or 3 days. The search and rescue managers say, at this stage, we're running out of hope that there will be survivors, and we're just going into recovery mode to try and find the aircraft and identify it, and then recover bodies. But again, too early to say. I have to say, I have seen a report that the aircraft has been found, but it's a single report. It's unverified, so I don't know that. And the report indicated that there were no survivors, but that is completely unverified. So we obviously continue to hold on hope that there will be survivors. If it was a helicopter, or if it was a Dornier, they are capable of flying very slowly. So it's quite possible that there were survivors. So all we have to do is continue to hope that there will be.
Dr. Guy Leitch, thank you very much for talking to us this morning. Appreciate your time. More news and views at the top of the hour.